Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper, CEO and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group. And I'm back for another exciting episode of HR We Have a Problem. This is the show where we break down the big and most relevant HR issues of the day. We help you make sense of what they mean for you, and we talk about what you might do about some of them. Joining me today is Thomas Otter. He's an HR tech expert, an industry analyst, and a general partner at Acadian Ventures. I hope I said that right. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Teri. Nice to be on the show.
Great to speak with you today. I assume you're back home in Germany this week. I know you were in Paris at Unleash last week, right?
I was in Paris at Unleash. It was great to be there. It was a lot of fun. Great to see the Unleash gang. And for those of you that are interested in world sport, there is a certain amount of rugby going on in Paris at the moment. It's the Rugby World Cup. So I've managed to go to Paris and watch that. So having a lot of fun. So
more to do than just HR tech, right?
Sure. Having grown up in South Africa, there's nothing more important than rugby, and it's the Rugby World Cup on at the moment. So it's great to be in Paris for the rugby and for HR tech, of course. For Unleash, of course. Yeah.
It's conference season, right? I was at HR Tech just the week before that. And then obviously a lot of the big vendors have been having their conferences. So a lot going on there.
Yeah, it's a conference festival at the moment. Yeah, my partner Jason was at the US HR Tech. It was pretty busy as well. So
it was
actually
packed.
Around the world. Yeah,
it really was. I didn't get a chance to connect with him, unfortunately. So I know we talk more generally about HR and things that are affecting or impacting HR on this show. Something we haven't talked a lot about is what's happening in HR in other markets, particularly outside the US and in some of the emerging markets. And our listenership is expanding. We've started to see quite a bit of global reach at this point. So knowing your background, I thought we could talk a little bit about what's happening in HR in emerging markets. And I'll be honest, I've gotten a little away from that in the last 5+ years. I was at Mercer for 20 years, so had spent a little bit more time in that space, but I'm anxious to learn a little bit and catch up, and hopefully won't ask any really ridiculous questions. Does that sound like a good plan for you for the conversation today?
That sounds like a great plan. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, then let's get into the huddle. So I didn't really do a detailed introduction of you. I'm sure I left out a lot in your background, and I know you've got a pretty expansive background in the HR technology space and HR in particular. Maybe you could start with a little bit of background and give us a little bit more on where you've spent your time, and then more specifically, what some of your experiences in the emerging markets.
Sure. So I grew up in South Africa, hence my accent. I started work for SAP back in South Africa in the 90s. And then I moved to Germany with SAP. Had quite a long career in SAP Germany, SAP UK, spent a bit of time in America as well. Then I went to Gartner, where I did quite a lot of research into HR tech, making magic quadrants and things. Performance management, payroll, and all those other topics were my areas of expertise based here in Europe. Then I rejoined SAP just after they acquired SuccessFactors, actually joined SuccessFactors. And I eventually became the head of product at SuccessFactors and running product for all the HR products at SAP. I left SAP about 6 years ago now. I went back to university, finished my PhD. And then I find myself doing more and more advisory work. And I got together with Jason Corsello, who you may know, but he used to be the head of strategy at Cornerstone, the learning management vendor. And he'd started a venture capital firm focusing on early stage future of work investing. And so basically I've taken my experience as a international HR tech product person and go-to-market person and so on, and taken that operator experience and now applying it as an investor. So we invest in early stage HR tech companies around the world. We've done investments in the US, we've done investments in all sorts of countries, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Ireland, in Mexico, in Kenya, in Malaysia. Germany and France. Where else have we done? Saudi Arabia, Singapore. So I won't say we've invested everywhere, but we've got a pretty broad portfolio of investments in early stage HR tech across the world. And over the years, I've spent a lot of time traveling. I think I've probably been to 50 or 60 countries. And I've always been interested in how the rest of the world thinks about HR tech. Of course, I've had an interest in what goes on in the US because so much comes from there. But I've also always had the view that there's innovation and exciting technologies elsewhere in the world, and not everything comes from Silicon Valley.
Right. Yeah. I read somewhere, I think you all are focused on the worker and work. And so as you think about that, are there some technologies in these markets that you think make the worker more productive? Are there some things we can learn from some of these markets that we're not seeing yet here in the US? I think it reminds me a little bit, I think about in some of these emerging markets, they often skip over some of the old technologies because they don't maybe have the infrastructure and jump right to the new technologies so they are a little bit ahead of the Western world.
Yeah, I would say so. I think I'm going to pick up on one in a minute. And I think that the interesting thing to remember is that there are roughly 3.2 billion people that go to work in the world, right? And when you think about that number and you say, okay, how many of those in the US? Well, let's do the maths for a moment. Let's call it, say, 250 million people go to work in the US. It might be 200 million, might be 300 million, but it's somewhere in that range, right?
Yeah.
And then you consider the rest of the world, it's just so much bigger and so much more variety as well. So one area where I think there's tremendous advances and different ways of doing things, we made an investment recently in Kenya, in East Africa. And what's fascinating about Kenya is roughly 75% of the GDP throws through a mobile app, right, called M-Pesa, right? And basically M-Pesa essentially serves as a bank account, it serves as your credit card or your payment mechanism, and it's driven entirely from a mobile phone. It doesn't have to be a fancy mobile phone, it can be a basic SMS phone. And so in terms of mobile literacy and using mobile commerce, I'd argue that Kenya is further along than many other countries. And that kind of surprises you when you first go there. But when you get in a taxi, you pay with your phone, you pay your hotel bill, you receive your pay slip, you do all sorts of things are happening through this app. And those are things that we're only just starting to do in many of the so-called advanced economies. So that's an example of where you have this technological leap. And what's interesting about this is that it's relatively constrained technology because it doesn't require your iPhone 15 or your fancy Android this or that to work. It works with very baseline and relatively simple technologies, and the transaction costs are very low. They've established through this. And so as we were looking at this market, we saw the opportunity as these economies are growing. What's happening is that governments are looking to move tax filing electronically. So I'd argue that almost everywhere in the world is ahead of the US in terms of tax filing technology, right? You've had various challenges in the US from lobbying and so on to restrict the abilities around individual tax filing and so on. And it's complicated by state and so on. And many economies around the world already have digital, quite sophisticated digital filing. And what this means is from a payroll perspective, you can be a lot more innovative in terms of how you pay people and how taxation is collected and managed. So what we've seen is that as countries move towards electronic filing, it drives a great interest in electronic payroll and in modernizing the payroll technology. So I think in that government to employer communication, there's a lot more sophistication in traditional Central European countries like Germany and France and so on. They've been doing electronic filing for a long time. Mm-hmm. But we're also seeing this take off in places like the Middle East. We're seeing it take off in places like Singapore and stuff, are kind of way ahead in terms of the use of those kind of technologies. And also in Latin America, we're seeing it in Mexico. We're seeing definite improvements in terms of the electronic filing processes there. And that drives an interest in having better HR systems to support that those regulatory requirements.
Yeah. So we've got some catching up to do, it sounds. So how are there other ways that HR is sort of leveraging this capability? Obviously, payroll is a big one. I read your recent example about a tax change in Kenya, and just what appeared to be very simple was a fairly complex set of rules for payroll. But I assume HR is taking advantage of that electronic capability to drive that through the organization in other ways.
Yeah. So another thing that we're seeing is there's been rapid adoption, I think, of WhatsApp as a tool for personal lives. People are using WhatsApp, has a very strong position, I think, in Europe and also in Africa. People use WhatsApp a lot for communication. So corporates have learned to use WhatsApp for communication. So I've seen a very interesting startup out of South Africa using WhatsApp for payslip distribution. So you get your payslip by WhatsApp because you might not have a computer at home. So I think that's one of the differences. Is I'm a big fan of constraints as an innovation driver. And in the US, everyone has not everyone, but a lot of people have a computer at home, right? And they have a computer at their job. And not everybody, of course, people, remote workers and frontline workers and so on might not have a computer, but most people have access to a computer at home. Whereas the assumption in many of the emerging markets is that the phone is the computer, right? So if you want to hire people, you can't have the assumption that they're going to go to a computer and fill in a bunch of forms for you. You have to engage with them within the context that you have, and often that's WhatsApp. So I've seen quite a lot of interesting enhancements in terms of recruiting through WhatsApp. So where you get into a dialogue, and it's either with a chatbot in the background or with a human, but you do this dialogue via the WhatsApp exercise or the WhatsApp to get that first level of interview and to collect the information and even share documents like copies of driver's licenses or whatever. A lot of that channel, WhatsApp, becomes the communication channel for that kind of communication. Similarly, we've made an investment in a company actually based in the US that is doing learning management via SMS or WhatsApp, because often that's the lowest common denominator. But so often you don't need to watch a YouTube video or a fancy video to get basic instructions. You can do that through text-based micro-learning. So again, an area where I think there's rapid adoption in markets where people don't necessarily have that computer at home or even that computer in the office to base on. So I think there's more assumption of the frontline worker-centric solutions in some of the emerging markets, and then perhaps there is in the US. So frontline worker solutions, I think I've seen quite a lot of interesting stuff out of Latin America and out of Southeast Asia. And there's a bunch of interesting stuff also in China. Again, there's a different set of technologies. So it's typically based on WeChat. Yeah. But again, high levels of mobile sophistication, driving really a different set of applications. We've not done any investments in China, but I'm always fascinated by what's going on there, just because of the level of mobile adoption is just, in sophistication there is often ahead of where we are.
Oh yeah. It sounds like you're seeing a little bit of an uptake in kind of the WhatsApp approach with learning in North America, I would say. Are you seeing more of that in other places? I feel like that's kind of been one of those areas that people have been afraid to step into in the US for security and other reasons. They've just sort of had this hands-off approach to using that kind of technology for the things that you described.
Yeah, I think where we're seeing a lot of evolution at the moment is in the frontline worker world. If we think back to most of the HR systems that have emerged over the last 20 years, they've been driven by the demands of corporate HR, right? Yeah. So they've tended to be knowledge economy based. They've tended to be office based. They've tended to be optimized for people that work in the office, because the economic buyer is in HR, and HR tends to be in an office. So a lot of the software has been designed with the optimized for the office experience. Whether it's actually been optimized or not is a different story. But the office worker was the main persona in which these systems were designed, the ones we know about. And when you look at places like retail or hospitality or even healthcare, the user experience of the frontline worker is very different. They're not sitting at a desk. They don't have 21-inch screen real estate. So the tools that drive the frontline worker experience are different, right? And they are constrained by the device that the person is using. And often the use case, the user doesn't have a corporate phone, right? So somebody who's working part-time at Walmart or a supermarket or whatever is probably not issued a corporate phone, and they're using their own private device for communication. So people are swapping shifts and doing other things via these tools anyway. So you might as well inject the corporate systems or the systems into that world. And that's why I think there's been such excitement about the frontline worker tooling. We're seeing that very much so here in Europe because there's such a shortage of frontline workers. So right. You always think about skills. Or we're short of nuclear physicists, or we're short of astronauts, or we're short of lawyers, or whatever it is. Maybe we're never short of lawyers, but we're always short of these so-called smart people, the people that have these long degrees and stuff. But actually, in many economies, the shortage is really in the frontline jobs. And so the tools that make those frontline jobs more efficient, more enjoyable, and better are the areas where I think there's a lot of excitement. A lot of excitement at the moment.
Yeah. What are you seeing in terms of the emerging markets? What are some of the things that they're struggling with the most? If you think about from the HR leaders' perspective, what are their top 3 issues? Is it talent? Is it pay equity? Is it transparency? What are they thinking about, and what's some of the focus?
I don't think you can label all emerging markets the same. I think it's quite different depending where you are. I think the issues if we take places like Singapore and stuff, are very similar to what they would be in other sophisticated markets. If I look at a lot of the issues in Africa, you have and sometimes you have high unemployment in particular areas, particular countries. So it's often about skills training, about training people. So the questions of training are becoming very important. You're often employers fill what are called institutional voids. So often the employer is taking on more of the education responsibility than perhaps you would imagine in other countries. There's often a lot more. There's a lot less formal structured benefits in healthcare and so on. So in many cases, in many emerging markets, progressive employers are taking on more responsibility in terms of the arrangements around benefits, for instance, in healthcare, or perhaps education for the employees' children. So there are a whole variety, I think, of different benefit plays that are emerging that happen in again, I don't really use the term emerging markets, but might happen sort of sub-Saharan Africa that might not happen somewhere else. So it's going to be different by country, by geography.
Yeah.
And I think the Western European challenges are similar in many cases, are similar to some of the North American challenges. Less so on the benefits, on the health benefits side. I think North America has its own challenges in terms of benefits costs. Those are less of a worry in Europe, but the skills questions, I think, are very similar in terms of the skills shortage question, the tension between AI automation and the skills shortage, and the demographics become important. What you see in Africa, for instance, is you have strong youth population that are unemployed. And so it's how can you, at a national level, is how can you find jobs for these younger people so that they can be the basis for the future. And so it's a very different challenge from what you face in say, North America, where you have a youth shortage. So the questions I think are super interesting at the moment is remote work. What you're seeing now is that, for instance, if you look at the software industry, the large software companies like Google and Microsoft, Amazon and so on, Oracle, SAP, are all building development centers in sub-Saharan Africa, in Kenya, in even Rwanda is a super hub for software development now, because basically you can put AWS or Azure or whatever in these locations, and you have kind of an equalization of access to technology. And then what it is access to human smarts. And so then these companies are now training up the next wave of developers. So there's huge growth of software engineering in Africa, and that I think is super exciting and will help drive those economies forward.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you thought the impact of remote work, or at this point, work from anywhere, right? I mean, that's really just changed the whole landscape, especially for any company, but largely tech companies. It's really given them access to a much broader, I think, talent pool around the world.
Yeah, correct. And one of the companies we invested in is Oyster, which is one of the leading remote work players. And the idea of one of the challenges we face is that in the world is that we have a unequal distribution of young people, right, and old people for that matter. But we have young people in Africa that want work. There's opportunities for work in the Western world and in wherever. But the one option is the world needs to solve its migration challenges, right? And so I'm a big fan of more open borders and more immigration. But on the other hand, you also want people to stay where they grew up. People want to live where their parents want to stay. And so those people that want to stay in those countries, remote work becomes super interesting because you can actually now start to work on interesting software projects for large software companies or startups or whatever without actually leaving where you're from. And I think that's in many cases a better solution and also is a more equitable solution because you start to see the equalization of earnings power. So people with strong technical skills in Africa can command, if you have remote work, can command higher billable hours or whatever than they might have been able to do so before. So, and they now have more open access to training. If you look at the Coursera's and all these tools, they open up lots of opportunities for people in emerging markets to have access to learning that they didn't have, that they might not have had before. So that will equalize the global skills base, and again, will be net positive for emerging market, for programmers and then for product managers and so on in emerging markets. So I think it's all goodness.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, even for a small business like ours at Sapient Insights, the number of people I've had reach out to me in the last year or two that are just around the world. A lot of people from Africa, basically looking for opportunities, wanting to provide some services to us that can easily be provided now remotely. I would have never thought that a small company would have employees around the world. And now it's easy.
The models have got so much better now with the remote, with the sort of global EOR models and stuff that people like Oyster have pioneered, that it does allow you access to, even small companies to have access to skills globally, and that people in those countries can then access work that previously they weren't able to access. So I think it's generally a very positive and exciting trend.
Yeah, I've been seeing the sort of that EOR market starting to grow. Are you seeing people more using EOR versus the traditional PEO, or does it really even matter?
I think there's sort of a blurring between those two concepts. You'll see the PEO model tends to be kind of country specific and constrained by the legislative requirements in the individual countries. So the PEO model is pretty popular in the US. It's less popular in Europe. And the EOR model, where it's essentially you just really want the record keeping and the basic contractual arrangements when you don't have an establishment, makes a lot of sense. But there's less of the model in Western Europe, at least, than there is in the US. But the EOR model is very interesting when you have a small number of employees in a particular country. Or small workforce, they're not your employees legally speaking, but the idea that there's some great software developers in Bulgaria or Rwanda that we'd like to work with, and we want to connect them to our business. We want them to work for us, but we're not in a position to set up an establishment in those countries. Then the EOR model works really well, And then that's really why folks like Oyster and Deal and others have been quite successful with that model.
Yeah. What's the opportunity you've talked about some of the big tech companies, but what's the opportunity for maybe some smaller tech companies to expand in these markets? What are some of the things they need to consider? Because I feel like as you said, there's a large talent pool there, and people need to look at that as an opportunity for their business and how they might expand. I mean, traditionally it was, hey, let's just put all of our programmers in India or Poland or China. And now there's just a much broader opportunity for talent in that space.
Yeah, I think, again, you can find great talent anywhere. I think the questions always revolve around, are there providers that can help you find the right talent? So So you'll find that the recruitment processes in these emerging markets, or like sub-Saharan Africa, are getting better and better. So it's easier to find candidates. The level of training that the people are getting is also going up. So it starts to be competitive with other emerging markets. But I think you need to view Africa probably like perhaps as you might have viewed India a few years ago. So you've got to be a bit patient with you can't expect to get exactly the same. You can't say, okay, this works in India, therefore it's going to work in Africa. The same way as you can't say this works in the US, it's going to work in India. So you're going to have to adapt to local market requirements. You're going to have to do your research about who to work with and so on. But I think it's entirely possible today to have developers in software developers in Rwanda and Kenya and Nigeria and South Africa and so on, working for startups in the US or startups in Europe. It seems to me to be obvious to be looking for global talent. Often what you get strong English skills. Most people are learning English as a second language. So you find strong English, you find strong English skills. And then what's also interesting, I think, especially for European countries, is it's the same time zone. So you don't have the same challenges as perhaps you might have with going to Asian locations, because you have the same time zone. The other challenges sometimes, although there be massive improvements in infrastructure, sometimes you have latency issues and other issues with communicating with Africa. But on the whole, I think it's only going to get better.
Yeah. What do you see as some of the risks? Obviously, the governments can be, and the types of legal and compliance and regulatory challenges that organizations need to think about when standing up some capabilities in some of these other countries. Are there some other risks they should consider as they think about expanding?
Yeah, look, the world is a complicated place, as we're seeing at the moment. So you can imagine that people that had outsourced processing to the Ukraine 2 years ago, weren't expecting that there would be a war in Ukraine. And simply, you have people that maybe outsourced Arab call centers to Gaza, and you don't know what's going to happen in world politics. So the same. But we can look at from the rest of the world when we look at US politics. We're also amazed at how the US continues to function effectively. But politics is politics. I think you do have to take you always have to take those macroeconomic risks into account. What I'd argue is that the local risks are probably lower than you think they are, and the macro risks are macro risks. But your issues, for instance, in terms of Kenya or Nigeria or Ghana or South Africa, are probably much less than you imagine, and much less than you imagine to be sitting somewhere else.
Yeah. I think we oftentimes are swayed by what we see on TV and just how bad things are somewhere. But when you're living there, I'm in Louisville, so I know a few years ago we were in the news quite a bit and looked to have some real challenges, which we do. Yeah. But at the same time, you're living in it when you're not seeing it the same way as somebody who's just seeing it through a YouTube video or through some news on
correct television. Yeah. News is always about the worst possible, typically about the worst possible outcome. So I would always say don't judge the IT skills of a country by what you watch on the news. Work with people, trusted people that understand those markets, and you'd be amazed at the opportunities that come through that.
Yeah. There's real people there, right? I mean, and I think HR kind of knows that.
Smart, ambitious people that want to learn.
Exactly.
You will find those you will find those people anywhere, and you need to accommodate for culture, for technology, for all sorts of other things. But I think it's incumbent on people to think, to be broad-minded in terms of where they hire from. You'd be amazed where great talent can be found. I mean, you look today at the number of CEOs and founders in tech that are immigrants. In the US, the number of immigrants that have founded tech companies, it's the first or second generation immigrants. It's their impact on the positive impact they've had on the US economy is remarkable. And seeing the same in Europe. And I think we are one of the great hopes with remote work for me is that we'll be able to grow great companies you're in Africa, in Latin America, and so on, without those founders having necessarily to move to America or Europe to be successful. But there's great talent everywhere, and I think with a bit of imagination and a bit of determination, we can do much more with it.
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, with all the negative things happening in the world today, there's a lot of great things happening as well, and it's a great time to be alive.
It is. I mean, I think of the example of one of the companies that was behind the great advances in vaccines was BioNTech, and that was founded in Germany by two immigrants. I think they were originally from Turkey, who came to Germany and then studied and developed that amazing business. So, being an immigrant myself, I'm biased, but I think it's a big part of success. And we find as investors that immigrants are often super driven and make great founders.
Yeah. We should do another show just talking about that, because I'd be very interested in hearing more about some of the organizations that you guys are investing in globally. I think there's a lot of disruption. There's a lot of opportunity. Yeah. There's just a lot of interesting things happening out there.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of AI. For instance, if you take Paris, for example, there's a lot of great AI going on in Paris at the moment. Same too, there's all sorts of things happening here in Germany. So I think one hears of the US all the time, and it's right, because it is, when you're there, you only hear about the US because that's just how the society is. But there is so much going on elsewhere.
Yeah, that's how it works.
Yeah.
Well, so I have one last question for you. Do you have some recommendations for organizations that might be considering getting into an emerging market or looking to staff in some of those markets? What would you tell them to think about just right out of the gate? Here are some considerations and before you get started.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. There's no such thing as emerging markets. It's that country or that region. So don't just think about Africa. Africa's not a country, it's a continent. So if you're thinking the situation in Kenya is very different from the situation in Ghana, or was it different from the situation in Tanzania? So you need to be aware of the different countries. So do your research. Talk to others. Talk to other people that have done it. You're not the first. Find out from other countries in your space, other companies in your space, have they been successful in getting resource from say sub-Saharan Africa? You probably don't want to be the first in your industry to be doing this.
Yeah,
I'd say do that, and then build strong local partnerships with providers that really understand that market. So again, folks like Oyster or Workmotion and Deal and so on that have done extensive work in those markets. Listen to what they have to say.
Yeah.
You have to do a bit more work. You have to do your research. You have to know what you're getting into. And I'd say maybe my last point on this: if your only driver is wage arbitrage, I think you're going about it the wrong way, because wage arbitrage is only ever short-term savior.
Right.
So if you're thinking you can get people really cheap there, you might get them cheap for a while, but then if those people are any good, they'll realize that they can make more money elsewhere and they'll leave you. So if you just view this as purely as a wage arbitrage exercise, I think you'll short shrift yourself. Think about it more holistically.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to step into it. I think a lot of people think, well, it's just going to be too complex. There's just going to be too much to worry about. It's hard to find good talent. So you've got to expand your horizons in some of these areas. So.
And again, I think if you work with these EOR models, it gives you a low risk way of experimenting. You can try those markets. You don't necessarily have to set up your own subsidiary anymore.
Exactly.
Obviously, if you're hiring 50 people in a country, then that's a different story. But for experimentation, you can work with you can work very effectively with the EOR model, and I'd urge companies to do that. I think you'll be amazed what you can do outside of where you've been traditionally looking.
Yeah. Well, Thomas, I really want to thank you for joining me today. This has been a great conversation, and I look forward to doing it again.
Great. It's been super being on, Teri. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah. I know you do a lot of writing, you blog, you're on Substack.
Yeah.
Where can people follow you? Because I know you write about this topic as well as a lot of others.
Yeah, if you just Google me, Thomas Otter, Actually, you've got to be kind of careful because there's a German professor called Thomas Otter as well, but he's a marketing professor. So if you probably Google Thomas Otter HR Tech, you'll find me. But I do have a Substack, and also if you go to our website, Acadian Ventures, you can find a lot of stuff there.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I also want to thank our producers, Brand Method Media Group, and our marketing team who will bring this awesome podcast to you in the next few weeks. And thank you for tuning in. That's it for this episode of HR We Have a Problem. If you enjoyed the episode, you can subscribe to it on your favorite podcast app. And we'd love it if you leave a review or drop us a line, schedule a chat, tell us some topics you want to hear about so we can get some people on the show to talk about some of those things. We will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of HR We Have a Problem. Thanks, everybody.